People were starting to say it's an East Coast, West Coast rivalry because it was people that's trying to make money. It was true people trying to make careers. It was people trying to get famous.
Diddy named Diddy 77 times in court documents related to Tupac's.
The courtroom was a tempest, a storm of whispers and stifled gasps as Marion, Suge Knight, appeared on the flickering video feed, his weathered face framed by the sterile backdrop of the penitentiary. The former DRR mogul, once the embodiment of power and menace in the music industry, sat with a grim expression that seemed to carry the weight of decades. His testimony wasn't just a bombshell, it was a seismic event that sent shockwaves through the courtroom and ricocheted far beyond its walls. And at the center of this storm was Sean Diddy Combs, a man who had spent years carefully crafting a public image of untouchable success, now visibly unraveling as the ghosts of his past clawed their way into the light.
And Tupac's a legend. Like I said, Tupac wasn't born, he was sent to us.
From the moment Suge Knight began speaking, the tension in the room hardened into something almost tangible, an oppressive force pressing down on everyone present. His allegations were not vague insinuations or the kind of half-truths often dismissed as prison gossip. They were specific, detailed, and damning. He claimed that in the mid-1990s, at the height of the East Coast-West Coast rap feud, Diddy had allegedly orchestrated a bounty on Shakur's life, a $1 million contract that, according to Knight, wasn't just industry hearsay but an open secret in the circles both men navigated. This wasn't just a courtroom drama, it was the unearthing of a dark chapter in hip-hop history. The timing of this testimony was no coincidence. Prosecutors had built their case meticulously, threading together allegations of racketeering, coercion, and exploitation to paint a picture of Diddy as a figure who had allegedly weaponized his wealth and influence to silence enemies and control those around him. Knight's testimony wasn't just about Shakur or the 1990s. It was part of the prosecution's broader strategy to establish a pattern of behavior, one that linked past violence to the charges Diddy now faced. And while Knight's credibility could be questioned, the weight of his words was undeniable. His testimony wasn't just one man's account. It was a grenade tossed into the carefully guarded fortress of Diddy's legacy.
The only man currently facing charges in the case, Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, claims that Sean Combs, also known as Diddy, paid for a hit on Tupac.
The courtroom wasn't just filled with legal professionals and jurors, it was packed with reporters, cultural commentators, and industry insiders who understood the significance of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. Diddy, who had long been seen as the ultimate survivor in an industry littered with cautionary tales, now found himself in a position he couldn't spin or charm his way out of. Every word from Knight was a dagger, each accusation peeling back another layer of the polished image Diddy had cultivated over decades. Suge Knight didn't just talk about the alleged bounty, he contextualized it within the atmosphere of the time. The rivalry between Death Row and Bad Boy Records wasn't just a feud, it was a full-blown cultural war that spilled out of the studio and into the streets. Knight painted a picture of an industry where power was enforced through intimidation and violence, where alliances were fragile and betrayals were inevitable. He described how the tension between the two labels escalated to the point where threats weren't just empty words, but promises waiting to be fulfilled. And at the center of it all, according to Knight, was Diddy, allegedly pulling strings and making deals in the shadows.
Right now, Davis is fighting for bail ahead of his trial, which he has pleaded not.
The prosecutor, seizing the moment, pressed Knight on the specifics of the alleged bounty. Knight claimed that the $1 million offer wasn't just a rumor, it was a directive. He alleged that intermediaries with ties to East Coast criminal networks had approached figures in the West Coast scene, offering money for the elimination of key death row figures, including Shakur and himself. Knight described these intermediaries as credible in that world, individuals whose words carried the weight of real danger. He even suggested that some of these figures had been seen in Las Vegas on the night Shakur was ambushed, their presence raising questions that were never adequately answered in the original investigation. What made Knight's testimony even more chilling was his assertion that the official investigation into Shakur's demise had been deliberately misdirected. He implied that powerful forces not just within the industry but potentially within law enforcement had a vested interest in keeping the case unsolved. The idea of a cover-up wasn't new, but hearing it presented in such a direct and public manner added a layer of intrigue that the courtroom could barely contain. Knight suggested that Diddy's financial and social clout could have played a role in ensuring that the truth never came to light, a claim that sent reporters into a frenzy, their fingers flying across keyboards as they tried to capture the enormity of what was unfolding.
At the end of the day, just to tell the truth, So hopefully we can get down to the bottom of this. I'm 100%, the charges against me are 100% false, and hopefully due to time, we'll start to see that.
Diddy's reaction was a spectacle in itself. For a man known for his unflappable demeanor, his ability to control a room with a smile and a soundbite, this was uncharted territory. As Knight spoke, Diddy's composure cracked. He whispered furiously to his legal team, his face a mask of barely concealed rage and disbelief. The optics were devastating. For a jury tasked with assessing his character, the contrast between Suge Knight's calm, methodical delivery and Diddy's visible agitation couldn't have been starker. It was a moment that no amount of legal strategy could undo. Outside the courtroom, the impact of Knight's testimony was immediate and far-reaching. Social media exploded, with hashtags related to the trial trending within minutes. News outlets scrambled to update their coverage, their headlines reflecting the gravity of the allegations. For a generation that had grown up with the unsolved mysteries of Shakur and Biggie's demises, this was more than a trial. It was the potential unraveling of stories that had haunted the culture for decades. Knight's claims weren't just about Diddy. They were about an entire era, a time when hip-hop's meteoric rise was shadowed by violence and tragedy.
In her civil lawsuit, Cassie said that she was the victim of abuse, assault, and at the hands of Diddy.
The prosecution, clearly emboldened by the impact of Knight's testimony, hinted that there was more to come. They suggested that other witnesses and evidence would corroborate Knight's claims, that this was just the beginning of a narrative that would expose the darker underbelly of Diddy's empire. Whether or not they could deliver on that promise remained to be seen, but the damage to Diddy's reputation was already done. The mere fact that these allegations were being aired in such a public forum was enough to plant seeds of doubt that would be nearly impossible to uproot. As the judge called for a recess, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Spectators debated loudly, their voices echoing through the halls. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras capturing every reaction, every whispered conversation. But amid the noise, one thing was clear. The trial had taken a turn no one could have anticipated. What had started as a case about present-day misconduct had transformed into an excavation of hip-hop's darkest secrets, a reckoning that threatened to rewrite the narrative of an entire culture.
A U.S. judge has ruled that the rapper and producer Sean Diddy Combs will stand trial on federal trafficking and racketeering charges in May. He'll be held in prison until then. Sean Combs has pleaded not guilty to charges that he used his business empire to transport women and male workers across state lines to take part in recorded performances. If convicted, he could face a life sentence.
For Diddy, the stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about the legal charges he faced. It was about his legacy, his place in history, and the stories that would be told about him long after the trial was over. And as Suge Knight's testimony continued to reverberate, one question loomed large. If even a fraction of these allegations were true, what else was Diddy hiding? The walls of his carefully constructed persona were crumbling, and the world was watching every brick fall. And just when the courtroom's tension seemed almost unbearable, the prosecutor shifted gears, steering the narrative into even darker and more intricate territory. This trial wasn't just pulling skeletons out of the closet, it was cracking open an entire mausoleum of secrets that had been buried for decades. The East Coast-West Coast feud, long mythologized as a tragic chapter in hip-hop's history, was suddenly being dissected under the harsh light of legal scrutiny. And the deeper they dug, the more sordid and tangled the story became. What had once been seen as a tragic byproduct of industry rivalries was now being painted as something far more deliberate, calculated, and sinister.
Hey, real quickly, all that commissary stuff, he's not getting any of that because people in the shoe have an abbreviated list. So he's out of luck. No stake for him. Yeah, he is on watch. This guy thought he would have went home. All of a sudden, he didn't get bond. Remember, the first night that he was there.
The prosecution, emboldened by the bombshells Suge Knight had just detonated, began to weave a narrative that connected dots most people didn't even know existed. They introduced testimony and evidence suggesting that what was once dismissed as mere rap beef had, in fact, evolved into a high-stakes power struggle where the rules of the game were rewritten in the blood of its players. Investigators had long hinted that the feud between Death Row and Bad Boy wasn't just about music. It was about dominance, influence, and the lengths some were allegedly willing to go to maintain their grip on both. One of the most chilling revelations revolved around the financial pipelines that allegedly fueled this Cold War. The prosecution hinted at a pattern of untraceable payments, cryptic transactions, and cash-fueled alliances that blurred the lines between legitimate business and underworld dealing. Industry insiders had whispered for years about the shadow economy that propped up certain players at the top. Money changing hands in backrooms, favors traded like currency, and a network of enforcers who operated just outside the spotlight. And if the prosecution was to be believed, Diddy wasn't just a participant. He was allegedly one of the architects.
Now, to the latest on the arrest of Sean Diddy Combs. This one has so many people talking. The disgraced music mogul facing federal racketeering, conspiracy, and trafficking charges. Both the prosecution and defense teams are set to discuss the next phase of action following the indictment as investigators work to determine potential co-conspirators. But how exactly did we get here?
The courtroom was shown documents that, while circumstantial, painted a damning picture of how influence was allegedly wielded behind the scenes. There were claims of payouts to consultants with ties to street organizations, vague contracts with inflated sums that didn't seem to correspond to any tangible work, and sudden windfalls for individuals who had no discernible connection to the music business. The implication was clear. This wasn't just a feud between two labels, it was a battlefront where resources were marshaled, alliances were bought, and enemies were neutralized in more ways than one. Then came the connections to the broader fallout of Shakur's ambush. The prosecution introduced testimony from a former associate of Diddy's camp, a man who had kept a low profile for years but had reportedly been compelled to cooperate after being subpoenaed. He claimed that in the weeks following the Las Vegas incident, there had been a flurry of activity within Bad Boy's inner circle. Meetings were held late into the night, phone calls were made to individuals with reputations that extended far beyond the music industry, and certain high-profile figures allegedly went to great lengths to establish airtight alibis. The message was clear. This wasn't panic, it was preparation.
Those individuals allegedly included high-ranking supervisors in the business, personal assistants, security staff, and household staff.
And then there was the matter of the subsequent tragedy that rocked the music world just months later. The prosecution didn't outright state that this second high-profile loss was engineered to cover tracks, but the implications were hard to ignore. They suggested that certain individuals who had been close to the events in Las Vegas had found themselves in increasingly precarious situations, as if their silence was being ensured through fear, coercion, or worse. The courtroom was left to wonder how many loose ends had been tied up in the years that followed and at what cost. Diddy's defense team worked tirelessly to dismantle these narratives, painting them as nothing more than the fevered imaginings of bitter rivals and opportunists. They argue that the so-called evidence was circumstantial at best, a patchwork of rumors and half-truths stitched together to create a narrative that served the prosecution's agenda. They pointed out the lack of concrete proof linking Diddy to any of the alleged actions, emphasizing that much of what was being presented relied on the testimony of individuals with questionable motives and histories.
This is very significant, just from who we associate Diddy being and everything we've seen him do over the decades. Like you said, this is quite the downfall to go from, we saw the mansions back in March that were raided by the feds. So to go from living in those mansions to being in a jail cell right now, I think it really underscores the magnitude of what he's facing and the weight of the federal government.
But even as the defense pushed back, the courtroom couldn't ignore the weight of what was being suggested. This wasn't just about Diddy's alleged role in individual incidents. It was about a culture of power and impunity that had allegedly allowed him to operate with near total freedom for years. The prosecution painted him as a man who had mastered the art of plausible deniability, someone who knew how to keep his hands clean while others did the dirty work. And if even a fraction of what was being alleged was true, it raised uncomfortable questions about how much the industry had ignored, enabled, or even participated in. Outside the courtroom, the ripple effects were already being felt. Fans, journalists, and industry veterans were grappling with the implications of what was unfolding. Social media was aflame with debates, as people tried to reconcile the image of Diddy as a cultural icon with a darker portrait being painted in court. Some defended him fiercely, arguing that the allegations were nothing more than a smear campaign designed to tear down a successful black man. Others pointed to the long history of whispers and controversies that had followed him, suggesting that where there was smoke, there was fire.
I think it's to be expected, just the shock of this and the questions about what is ahead of us. How long is he going to be in custody? Is this an R. Kelly situation? Is he going to not get out for a number of years? Is he going to end up serving a long-term prison sentence from this? Or does he have a chance of beating these charges at a trial that could come, within the next 2 years?
And as the trial continued, more questions emerged. How deep did this alleged web of influence and intimidation go? Who else might have been complicit, whether through action or silence? And perhaps most chillingly, what other secrets were still waiting to be uncovered? The courtroom had become a crucible, a place where decades of history, grudges, and unspoken truths were being forced into the light. And for Diddy, the stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about his freedom, it was about his legacy, his empire, and the story that would be told about him for generations to come. But with every new revelation, the narrative became harder to control. The prosecution hinted that they had more witnesses waiting in the wings, individuals who had been part of the inner circles that kept the industry's wheels turning. They suggested that these witnesses could provide further insight into how power was allegedly wielded. Deals were made and conflicts were resolved. And while the defense would undoubtedly fight tooth and nail to discredit them, the mere possibility of additional testimony was enough to keep the courtroom on edge.
It's a question of that, but when you read through the indictment, it's pretty clear who could be indicted as a co-conspirator. Right now, there are people in the indictment who would be considered unnamed co-conspirators, but clearly have played a role in this conspiracy. And I think prosecutors have some big leverage on them because they're hoping that they testify against Diddy as prosecution witnesses.
For now, one thing was clear. This trial wasn't just about the charges Diddy faced. It was about the very foundations of an industry that had long thrived on a mix of glamour and grit, success and scandal. And as the walls continued to close in, the world was left to wonder just how far this story would go and what other truths might be revealed along the way. Let us know what you think down below. Are we finally seeing the real story emerge, or is this just another chapter in a saga of blame and betrayal? Keep watching, because this is far from over.